Welcome to another special episode on how to create a RESTful API using Laravel. This episode is special because the idea of creating this tutorial actually came from the people who had watched our earlier tutorial on how to implement JWT authentication in a REST API in Laravel. So let's begin a step-by-step approach on how to implement OAuth 2.0 authentication. We will continue building on the same code base which is using the Dingo framework. So to easily implement OAuth 2, let's use a package called OAuth-Server-Laravel, which is version 5.1. So include that in your composer under the require section. And if you don't have a composer installed in your project, do that. Show your project path, and that will install the composer. Once that is done, run composer update so that the OAuth server Laravel package is installed in your code base. So once that is done, include the providers which are coming as part of the package within the app.php file under the providers section. So once that is included, you also need to include the authorizer alias path within the same app PHP file under the alias array. And then within kernel.php, include the middleware dependency. So this will handle all your exceptions related to auth. And also include these 4 dependencies under the route middleware. So these are all related to the routes which we will define under the routes.php. So we have the dependencies added under routes middleware. One other thing that you need to take care is that the CSRF token reference has to be removed from the middleware section and then included under the route middleware section as CSRF as an array. So we include it under the array route middleware. So that's also included. Once that's done, the next step is to create the config file related to auth package which we installed. So just run artisan vendor publish, which will generate the config file as well as the migrations required. So you have the OAuth 2 config which we can customize at later point to actually include the grant types and the access token TTL, etc. So we have the OAuth 2 config ready. Let's run the migration and create the tables required. So let's check whether the migrations are available under the migrations folder. So at the top you can see that there are multiple OAuth related table migrations being created. So we need to execute those and create those tables in our server. So run the migration command and it creates all the migrations. So once that's done, let's configure the package service provider. Either you can do it under the service provider or under Bootstrap, or you can create your custom class called OAuth service provider and use it. So a couple of options are given. I'll go with the second approach where I'll create an OAuth service provider class. So these service providers will make sure that the resolver methods gives you back the user or the client which is actually making the call. So under providers, create a custom class. OAuth service provider, which will inherit the service provider in class. So it will have a boot section as well as a register section. So we will include this class, and at a later point we'll include the resolver method implementations. So you have the provider set user resolve and set client resolve methods available within the boot method. Keep the dependencies included by importing the required classes, and that section is almost done for us. Now for any new added classes, if it has to be referenced properly, then you'll have to run the composer dump autoload so that the autoload files are generated properly. So once that's done, let's move to the next part of the steps, which is actually setting up the grants required. So OAuth comes with multiple kinds of grants like password, RefreshToken, etc. So in this case we will use a couple of them called PasswordGrant. You'll have to include it within the config section of the OAuth config file which got generated. So you include the password grant type, which will have a callback method called verify, which we'll implement at a later point, as well as a refresh token. This is required in case you want to refresh your token once the access token expires, or within the duration when a token is available. So you specify the access token TTL. I have kept it to almost a month because I'll be using it in a mobile app, and I'm not expecting it to expire any sooner. So the next step is to actually insert the client instances to the database. So I create a model called auth-Client. So this will be directly mapping with the OAuth clients table, which we migrated previously. So once the model is created, we include the table reference. So it is OAuth clients table. As well as the fillable parameters. In this case, it will be ID, secret, and name. So I take the code piece of code snippet from another class and use it here. So that's the fillable. I have the ID, secret, as well as the name, which is the client name, which will be using, let's say, a website or a Android application or an iOS application. So our model is in place. The next step will be to actually create the seeds and insert the data required. So let's create a table seeder. It's an AuthClient table seeder. So if you're not aware of what a seeder is, then it's actually something which will help you insert data from the Laravel end. So it creates your table seeder. I'll just rename it to AuthClient table seeder. And the class and the file name should match. I'll get rid of the factory methods, which will create dummy objects, and then create our own instance of OAuth client. So we need to pass the ID, which will be the secret or the client ID, and then the client secret, and the name of the client. So let's take some random generated values which we will use. Let's say, so the client ID and secret are unique for the version of the clients which you will be using. So I'm creating an Android client ID and secret here. Also, if I'm supporting a web application, then I create another client ID for that. So these are required to extend the security that we are providing, which normally will be just based on the username and password. This will allow you to extend it a little more and have a know of from which client the request is coming and whether the client is valid or not. So once that seed is done, let's run it. If it does not identify the class, then run the composer thumb autoload command so that it is added to the autoload. This time we don't have any issues, so the data is inserted. So let's try running a select query and see whether the data is inserted properly. We'll be querying on the auth clients table. You can see that couple of values which we tried inserting is there. Next step will be to create the routes to access the token which will be generated using the user details. So let's check whether we have any users in place using which we can test the application or the API. So we have one user data available which we will use to test. So we have a password as well as an email ID available. So let's create the routes required using the Dingo routes which is already installed in this project. So that's our route. Once you call OAuth access token with the user credentials, it should ideally return you the access token. So include the authorizer reference which is coming as part of the package. So with this, let's try making a request using Postman, which is a Chrome extension tool which lets you make HTTP calls. So I have the access token method, and let's run our server. It's running on 8000 port. Let's modify the request parameters. These are the user credentials which are available in the DB right now. So I have to replace the client ID and client secret with the one which we have inserted. So let's grab hold of the Android client ID and secret. And let's execute and see what happens. So there is something which needs to be changed in the route. So we are including a version 1 instead of that API. Let's replace and use version 1. Still we have some issues, and you can see that a non-static method, so we need to ideally use the alias thing which we defined instead of actually including the authorizer instance. So that's also fine, but we have another problem here. So we need to define some more steps before it will start working. So let's include whatever auth service provider custom class we included. The reference for that is not yet included under the app.php, so we need to include that. And also content resolver should return the user which is authorized. So let's also include that. Pass the ID and get the user. And return that user. So we have the content resolver, or this user resolver is set now. Also we need to define a PasswordGrantVerifier custom class which we'll include under a verifiers folder. PasswordGrantVerifier is the class, and we'll include the callback within this class. So all this class does is to include the or receive the credentials and authorize it and respond back with the ID of the user if it is available, or else it will respond with the false or not identified response. So that's also in place now. Because it's a new class being created, we'll run the dump autoload again. Let's run and see. Still some errors. So there must be some namespace issue here. So let's fix that. So it should be included as a app verifier's namespace. Let's try now. So auth should be default illuminate auth. And this time it works, and so we received an access token and a refresh token. So we are done with the implementation of the access token receiving part. So let's check whether it is working for unauthorized users. So we change the, so you see that the user credentials are not correct, so it validates that. Also, let's see whether if we change the client ID, what's the response which we receive. So it says the client is not authentication failed for the client. So similar is the case with secret. So those has to be the right ones for receiving the correct access token. So once that's done, let's try validating the access token which we received. So all we need to do is if that access token is passed as part of the header as a bearer token, then the server has to receive it and validate it, and if it is a valid user token, then it should return it as a valid user. So that's what we'll try to do here. So we are using the Dingo provided auth method call. So even if you are using a regular Laravel implementation, the implementation will not change much. So we have everything in place. It receives a token, authenticates, and responds if it is a valid user. So let's add the route. So it is calling the Dingo provided API route. So we'll call the route as user validate and call the method within the user controller called validate user. So we have the route in place. Let's try calling this and see whether we receive it as a valid user. So that's our access token. We'll call the user validate route. Pass the authorization header as a bearer token. And execute. So our server is running on the 8000 port. Let's change that. And it should work this time around. So we see that the user is authorized with that access token. So if we make a modification to that token, we should ideally receive a 401 or which is access denied for that specific token. So that's also working fine now. Hope you liked this video. If so, please give your thumbs up by liking the video. Also, please check all other related videos in this playlist if you require more clarity on the initial implementations. Subscribe to our channel and watch out for more interesting episodes. Cheers.